Now, I would like to give the floor to Professor Alistair Smith, and he is a faculty member of the Department of Politics at New York University, and he had previously held faculty positions at Yale University and Washington University, and he had published many papers in scholarly journals and co-authored numerous books, including the Dictators Handbook, which is on the...
Well, I thought I'd draw some lessons from it. I was a little scared by what Ruben was saying. That was a list of things we were supposed to be talking about. Because being an academic, I'm sort of very much used to the luxury of being able to talk about exactly what I want to talk about. So that's exactly what I'm going to do. I'm going to talk about what I want to. And I got shoes I can run in, because I might say some very unpopular things about foreign aid and some even more unpopular things about the United Nations. So I've been warned I can get out that door if I need to in a hurry. Okay, so I have a teenage son, so I'm thinking about teenage formative memories, and my teenage formative memory was Freddie Mercury singing at Live Aid. Okay, I see the younger people in there just looking at me with completely blank faces. There was a horrible famine in Ethiopia, and a bunch of rock musicians put on a great show. They raised probably around $150 million. Unfortunately, recent sort of estimates, I was just drawing for a recent article in the London Times, that up to 90% of this aid got diverted towards buying weapons instead of food. A lot of it paid for trucks that was used for forced migration. Lots of people died, in the hundreds of thousands. So we'd like to think of the wonderful thing on the left, that's Freddie Mercury singing, but we often see it's filling up the coffers. Live Aid was, at least the stuff on the left was great, stuff on the right not so great. It was cheap compared to many other sort of aid policies, if we want to flip on. So I've just quickly got this idea that this is a quick graph of how much money the United States has given to Egypt over the post-war period. It's well over $100 billion. That's in current dollars. And I think it would be fair to say that most of us, given where the big spike is, we realise that most of this aid was being given in order to solicit policies from the Egyptians, mainly the recognition of Israel and peace. So let me give you a little bit of logic, and I'll draw on some of the comments that Ruben just gave us. So I want to think about the logic of aid. For me, the logic behind aid is Democrats buy dictators. And the logic here is that to think about society in terms of the number of decision makers, or the access to decision makers, was exactly the term that Ruben calls. I call that the number of people in the winning coalition. So in a democracy, for example, in the United States, you need tens of millions of supporters to come to power and stay in power. In an autocratic state, that number could be double digits, triple digits, thousands, but it's not tens of millions of people. So the reality is, if you want to do something that's unpopular with these people, you can just compensate them with cash. So if they hate it by $100, you give them at least $100 and keep the rest for yourself. If you've only got a few thousand people to buy, that's not a lot of money to make a policy concession. Democrats have tens of millions of supporters to keep happy. How do you keep such a large number of people can all be bought by the same policy concession and only give up a few dollars each in revenues? And so this is the nature of, this to me is the nature of how aid works. And I think it's somewhat insipid. So it works out really well for the people in the democracy. They get the policy they want. It works out great for the leaders and the cronies in the autocracy, but it's really bad for the citizens. So I've got a little quick graph, just a little bit of evidence for this. So this is very simply, I entitled this Not Buying Love. So this is a quick graph of the amount of money the US have been giving to various foreign nations. And this is a Pew survey, I think in 2002, looking at a number of people who had a really unfavourable opinion of the United States. So what's the proportion of people that hate the United States? Well, we can see that a large number of the countries that get an awful lot of aid, the countries getting the billions of dollars of aid per year from the United States, are the ones that hate the United States. So if this aid is really helping the people, we really might want to question, are we doing the right thing here? Why do the people hate it so much? So on this question of sort of insipid Aid, I'm going to claim that aid has a somewhat pernicious effect, and I'm going to give you the idea of what I call a natural experiment. Because we would like to think that we give aid to the most needy cases, and the most needy cases aren't expected to do well, right? People die in hospitals. It's not that hospitals kill them, it's that the sick people go to hospitals. So we might think there's problems with aid. So I want to do a little natural experiment here. I want to look at nations that get elected to the United Nations Security Council. Okay, and I'm assuming, I'm not going to explain how that happens. I'm assuming everybody knows 2-year term, can't be re-elected for the next 2 years. And there's substantial evidence you get more aid when you get elected to the Security Council as a rotating member. Kazimko and Worker put it at about 56%. I've got some data here about the probability that if you weren't getting any aid, the US will start giving you aid the next year that you get elected, if you get elected, if you don't. You get more aid, you get more IMF programs, World Bank programs, more money from the UN, the Asian Development Bank, or whichever organization, you get more money. Okay, so, but you get it as a shock because you now have favors to sell. So this gives us a nice chance to see you get this sort of exogenous reason to get aid. And I'd like to point out that hopefully this should make nations better if aid is doing the job. But unfortunately, I'm going to tell you that it's not. Can I look at the next slide? So what I've got here is, for those who do statistics, is a matching design. So we look at nations who got elected to the UN Security Council and compare them with their comparable peers, nations of similar population and wealth and level of democracy. And I'm just going to focus on the purple columns. The purple columns correspond to non-democratic states. And this tells us over the 4-year period, the 2 years you're in and 2 years you're not eligible for re-election, it does, what's the change, what's the growth rate in your country relative to a peer country that didn't get elected to the UN Security Council? And on average, non-democratic states elected to Security Council grow 5% slower over those 4-year period than their peers. Okay? They also, on this here, they lose about 6% on a 100-point scale of press freedoms. So they become less free, they become less wealthy, and if I look at the next slide, they also become less democratic. Okay? So I find aid not such a great thing for sustained development. I'm actually going to argue that aid is actually pushing us in the wrong term. Getting elected to the UN Security Council gives you access to more aid, but it turns out that actually harms, not hinders the people. Okay, so I'm sort of going to look at the next slide because I love to do everything by, since I lecture undergraduates, I love to do everything by cartoons. So this is a cartoon that came from the Irrawaddy, which is a Burmese newspaper. I don't think it's published in Burma for fairly obvious reasons. This was following Hurricane Nargis that killed, the official total was 137,000 people, but it was probably more like 500,000. And I'm sort of going to claim that sort of development agencies, the United Nations, and countries that need development assistance are very much addicts and enablers. Okay? So we would like, as potential donor countries, the United States, rich, wealthy democracies, would like to be helping the poor person on the right-hand side. That's our image. That's what the whole Live Aid thing was about. There are people starving in Africa. We must do something. Or there are people hit by a horrible flood. The reality is autocratic regimes are addicts who can't get enough aid money because aid money allows them to buy political support and become less democratic and suppress the free press. Okay. So let me just give you one quick piece of evidence. I don't want to go too long or I'll be in big trouble. But this is from the 2010 floods in Pakistan. This is just looking at how aid was distributed across different districts according to whether the district voted for the majority for the PPP, the ruling party, versus the non-PPP. So this is the proportion of people who were affected by the floods and whether they received disaster assistance. So in PPP dominant districts, 80% of people received assistance. Outside of those areas, they weren't. So there's evidence that aid is being funneled to help people. I'm probably going a little long, so do you want to skip through that? I could tell you that disasters are actually really good for autocrats staying in office, but we'll skip on. So I sort of, no, go back, go up. So down. Sorry. Okay, so I sort of want to think what's been going on in Pakistan That's just happened to be where I had slides. I'm not picking on Pakistan as any particular country, just it was one that I had some notes on when I was putting these together. Between $6.6 billion of aid over about a 6-year period was pumped in. Estimates of that military aid is that only a small fraction of it, around 10%, actually ever made it to the military. What were we were trying to get? What were the concessions we were trying to get from Pakistan? Well, they failed to deliver probably on the primary one. That's to help bin Laden. Let me go back to the floods. The level of aid was enormous that was pumped into Pakistan. It was, and I have the number, it was about $1.7 billion of assistance was promised to the flood victims. That's about 20 times per person affected to comparable floods in Bangladesh and Benin in similar periods. So there was really some favourites. We might think there was reasons that we want to pump money in there. What I find most shocking about this was following great big floods in the 1970s in Pakistan, $900 million was spent on capital projects to prevent similar floodings occurred. And on paper, all of these dams and irrigation systems should all be up and in operation. But in practice, these were things that were never delivered. The money never got spent on these projects. Only on paper did it get spent. So I want to think a little bit about perverse incentives. If you do a good job if you're a political leader in a developing country and you do a good job, the response is less people get harmed by natural disasters. Less people starve, you get less money, you get less aid, you get less graft. You actually have an incentive. The way we've set up the aid community to respond to natural disasters, we're providing incentives to do a bad job. Because aid won't flow unless people get affected. So putting people in harm's way is not such a great idea. What's the policy fix? It's really hard. I would go back to the idea that I put of addicts and their enablers. If you're an enabler, what's the way that you're in the drug treatment community? How do you help an addict off there? You've got to have detachment. There's no need, we can't be compassionate, but continuing to provide aid simply perpetuates this system. And if you do want to give aid, I think it's much better to pay for good results than pay for disasters. So a much better thing might be to say, we'll put money in this escrow fund, and providing work is done to alleviate poverty, we've pre-committed that we will pay you to give you the money to fix problems. But we're not going to give it to you because you failed. We're going to give it to you so you succeeded. By committing to give the money and already having spent it and taken it out of your control and giving it to some neutral body to hand out in response to good policy success means that people have incentives to actually fix problems rather than to continue to allow people to be hit by natural disasters or to die in famines. I would very much, anyway, that's my policy fix if I had to give one, was don't give money for disasters, give it for success. Okay. And shall I run now?
Actually, I think you are safe. We can see at least anyone.
Sorry, I did say a few bad things about the US.
Thank you for your presentation, Professor. And we actually there is a gap between the academic research and the policy making and decision makers. And I think with these discussions and panels, at least we can contribute to narrow that gap.